Someone asked Harry a genuinely simple question on a podcast recently. What do you actually do for a living? And what came back wasn't really an answer at all. It was a man visibly searching for something, anything to say, landing eventually on full-time dad, a phrase that sounds warm enough on the surface right up until you actually sit with everything it's quietly covering for underneath.
Prince Harry, who has absolutely humiliated himself in a podcast interview recorded at the tail end of his disastrous UK return. Folks, this is a hot mess. It is a disaster, a humiliating new low for Harry.
That single moment, more than anything he actually said afterward and the rest of the conversation, is why this particular interview has become such a genuine talking point across multiple platforms and multiple audiences. Not because of one bad joke, and not because of one awkward pause sitting there in isolation. Because of what it accidentally revealed, almost against his own intention, about where things genuinely stand for him right now. Let's set the scene properly first. This wasn't a major broadcast interview with careful preparation behind it. Harry showed up on a relatively niche podcast hosted by rugby player Joe Marler. Nothing wrong with Marler or his show specifically, it's just not the kind of platform that typically generates mainstream headlines on its own, which made the choice itself a little curious before a single word was even spoken. Why there? Why now? And then came that exchange. I'm a veteran and I'm a prince, Harry said, fumbling slightly even on his own titles, before eventually settling on full-time dad as the actual answer to what he does.
Inventor? Would you call yourself the inventor or?
The inventor
Of
the Invictus Games?
Yes.
Inventor. Founder?
Founder.
That's
Probably the better word.
All right, okay,
Yeah,
great.
fair enough. Yeah.
Duke/inventor, yeah.
Do
Do you know how to spell inventor?
It's worth pausing on that phrase specifically, because underneath the warmth, it's genuinely just a polite way of saying, I don't currently have a conventional job. And the numbers behind that admission are fairly stark. Speaking fees that once reportedly commanded 7 figures per appearance have apparently dropped as low as $50,000, and even those opportunities are said to be drying up. Endorsement deals, charity partnerships, the whole commercial infrastructure that once surrounded him, all of it reportedly contracting rather than growing. So, when a prince, a man born into more institutional advantage than almost anyone alive, is reduced to describing himself primarily in terms of parenting because there's genuinely not much else left to point to professionally, that's worth sitting with rather than laughing off.
To say this man is a disgrace to the British royal family, to say this man is so diminished that he would now leave his late grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, rolling in her grave. To say this man is crude and rude and a bully and a homophobe and all of those things that he has proclaimed he is not over the past few years is also an understatement.
There's a broader question worth sitting with before we move to the next thread, and it's genuinely uncomfortable. How does someone born into this level of institutional advantage, with resources most people could never dream of, end up genuinely unable to answer a question that basically anyone else would handle in a single sentence? It's not that full-time dad is a bad thing to be. It's that the hesitation before landing on it, the visible searching, suggests something underneath that goes beyond simple modesty about not having a formal title to point to. Then there's the Invictus framing, which came up again during that same conversation and which deserves its own moment of scrutiny. Harry talks about the games in a way that consistently positions him as the singular creative force behind them. The guy who built this thing from nothing. Except that's not really accurate. A large team of people did the actual foundational work, the organizing, the years of unglamorous logistics that turn an idea into a functioning international event.
Shower and a shave.
Yes.
All at the same time.
No,
You can't shit in the shower. Like, a friend of mine actually did shit in a shower and refused to get rid of it. I dealt with it.
Do I know this person?
We should move on back to you answering.
How did you get rid of it?
Harry's role, by most credible accounts, was considerably closer to figurehead and inspiration than architect. Watching him take individual credit for what was genuinely a team effort is the kind of detail that starts to grate once you notice it, because it happens consistently rather than as a one-off slip. If you're finding this breakdown useful, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep digging into the details that get glossed over elsewhere. Now here's where the conversation took a turn that a lot of listeners found genuinely uncomfortable rather than simply awkward. At one point, talk drifted toward people losing bowel control on a motorway. an actual real topic of conversation on this podcast, not an exaggeration.
Occupation.
Full-time dad.
At least he said dad first. He did say dad first. Good for him.
British Army veteran.
Which means that he's unemployed.
Ouch.
And earlier in the same interview, Harry made a joke referencing grooming in a tone that a lot of people listening felt was wildly inappropriate given his age and his position. Podcasts like this are usually a calculated move for someone in Harry's position, a way to seem relatable, to say implicitly, hey, I'm just a regular guy. That's typically the goal. But when you actually listen to what came out instead, you get a considerably less flattering picture than the one presumably intended. Here's the thing that I think gets missed in a lot of the reaction to moments like this. Harry has essentially never been on the receiving end of real, sustained social consequence. He's more often been the one holding institutional power in any given room, not the one navigating around someone else's power over him. And when a person spends years surrounded almost entirely by agreement and flattery, with nobody in their orbit willing to say the joke didn't land or the timing was off, that absence of honest feedback doesn't create growth. It creates exactly the opposite, a kind of self-reinforcing bubble where your own read of a situation just keeps getting confirmed regardless of whether it's accurate. That's genuinely the pattern a lot of people believe they're watching play out here.
Harry said the true but out loud full-time dad. What does that mean? That is a euphemism for I have no job. The speaking engagements have gone from $1 million per speech to 50,000, and he's not even getting those. The business deals, the partnerships, it's over. The charity collaborations, the whole thing is heading south for Harry, which is why when he's asked what his occupation is, the first thing he comes up with is full-time dad. I mean, if you've got kids, then, you are.
Someone drifting further from an accurate read of how they're actually landing with an audience, with each repetition making the gap a little wider rather than narrower. And here's what makes it specifically unsettling rather than just mildly cringeworthy. At 41, most people have developed real, functional social intuition. You learn, through years of ordinary interaction, to read a room, to notice when a joke has gone quiet rather than gotten a laugh, when the temperature in a conversation has shifted, and to adjust accordingly almost without thinking about it. That instinct either isn't there for Harry, or it's being actively overridden by something else. Whether that's inability or stubbornness probably doesn't matter much in terms of the outcome. The effect is the same either way.
This is because he lost, didn't he, that court case last week, and he doesn't have the money to pay legal bills of up to 20 million after humiliating defeat, but A-list pal Elton might come to the rescue. And Meghan is furious. What does that mean? Why is she furious?
Well, Meghan is furious because she hasn't done everything she wanted. When they knew they were going to come to the UK and London.
Someone continuing to talk, joke after joke, past the point where the room has clearly stopped responding, apparently without registering that anyone's checked out. If you've ever watched a family member slowly drift from an accurate sense of how they're actually being perceived, you probably recognize that specific, uncomfortable feeling. Standing next to someone, sensing the disconnect, wishing you could just interrupt it but genuinely not knowing how without damaging the relationship further. Some people eventually choose honesty anyway, even knowing it'll strain things, because staying silent starts to feel worse than the discomfort of saying something. That's reportedly the kind of intervention Harry's own family never really delivered, at least not in a way that stuck. Which maybe explains what happened once this podcast actually went online.
He's not the inventor or founder of the Invictus Games, and it's so obnoxious he takes credit for the huge team of people that did create it and made it happen.
The public reaction wasn't just critical, it was close to unanimous. Scrolling through the response, you'd be hard-pressed to find a single defender anywhere in the mix. And that's genuinely notable, because online spaces usually shelter almost every conceivable viewpoint. There's a defender for nearly anything, however unpopular. Here, there simply wasn't one. That kind of unbroken, near-universal consensus is genuinely rare enough online that it starts to function almost like a verdict handed down, rather than the ordinary back and forth of typical internet criticism.
Very weird how Prince William showed up on the New Heights podcast with the Kelce brothers. And we actually watched this and I was engrossed, and actually pretty fascinating interview. I actually very much enjoyed it. A hit podcast, got a lot of views, did very well. Yes. So of course Harry couldn't stop himself, could he, Sue? had to go show up on a podcast I've never heard of. No offense to this guy, but the Joe Marler We'll See You Now podcast decided to have Prince Harry on.
The public takedown itself moved genuinely fast once it started gaining momentum online. A man with no clear job, nannies handling much of the actual parenting he's centering his identity around, titles that don't function as employment in any conventional sense. Prince isn't a paycheck, Duke doesn't come with a job description. Different commentators kept arriving at some version of the same conclusion independently, which is its own kind of evidence. There's something worth naming plainly about why this specific comparison landed so much harder than any of the individual criticisms did on their own.
But here's the difference. He was always within the royal circle to be protected, to have his image cleaned up, or to help him with that. Right now, he doesn't have anyone around him controlling anything that he does. Who would advise him to even go on this show?
Comparisons involving strangers are easy to dismiss. Different upbringing, different pressures, different circumstances entirely, so the comparison never quite sticks. A comparison to your own brother, someone who shared literally the same childhood, the same institution, the same fundamental starting conditions, removes almost every one of those escape routes. There's nowhere left to point except toward the actual individual choices each of them made along the way. Stay with me, because there's a comparison that landed on top of all this almost immediately, and it made everything considerably harder to look past or explain away. Around the same general period, William appeared on a podcast with the Kelce brothers, and the contrast was genuinely stark. William came across polished, self-aware, comfortable in his own skin without needing to perform relatability for anyone. No stumbling, no cringe. Just someone who seemed to understand exactly who he is and wasn't trying to convince the audience of anything. The response was overwhelmingly positive, not the muted, uncomfortable reception Harry's appearance generated, but genuine warmth. And here's what makes that comparison land as hard as it apparently has for a lot of people. William is 41 too. Same starting point, essentially. Born into the same institution, the same resources, the same fundamental access to opportunity from birth. Two brothers who started from nearly identical positions, arriving at strikingly different outcomes. That side-by-side comparison does something a single bad podcast never could on its own. It removes circumstance as the explanation. If it were purely about the pressures of royal life, both of them would presumably be showing similar strain. They're not. Which leaves character and choices as the more obvious explanation, and that's a considerably harder conclusion to sit with than blaming external circumstances. Then came the detail that reportedly tied the whole narrative together for a lot of observers. William has apparently cut off contact with Harry almost entirely. Once that specific detail circulated widely enough, a lot of the surrounding public judgment appeared to harden almost overnight from loose speculation into something considerably closer to settled, shared consensus. Not just career struggles anymore, but a fuller picture, someone genuinely adrift, disconnected from people who were once closest to him. What's genuinely worth naming honestly here, before moving on, is just how unusual that particular level of consensus actually is in the current online landscape. Social media sentiment is normally volatile. People build reputations up, tear them down, occasionally rebuild them again later. Forgiveness and second chances are the more typical pattern over time. This reads differently. When enough independent voices arrive at the same read without any obvious coordination, it stops functioning as ordinary criticism and starts looking like something closer to shared, settled fact. And there's a specific weight to that kind of digital record that's worth sitting with. None of this disappears. Clips get archived, comments stay searchable indefinitely. Anyone doing due diligence in the future, a future colleague, a future connection of any kind, will eventually find this moment sitting in the record. What makes it linger isn't that it was scandalous in the traditional sense. It's that it stripped away performance and showed something closer to the unguarded version of the person underneath, in a moment where he apparently wasn't managing the impression the way he usually does. There's a version of this story that's genuinely worth acknowledging before we go further, in fairness to Harry as a person rather than just a public figure being dissected, being scrutinized this intensely. Having a single interview picked apart word by millions of strangers is a genuinely brutal experience regardless of what led to it. Nobody deserves to have their worst moment treated as their entire identity forever. But acknowledging that discomfort doesn't erase the substance of what actually happened in that interview, or the pattern that a lot of separate observers, independently, keep landing on when they look at the fuller picture. If this kind of detailed breakdown is what you come here for, subscribe to Palace Insider so you don't miss what we cover next. There's genuinely more to this particular story than just one bad podcast episode. Because what's actually unfolding here goes considerably beyond a single interview that didn't land well. This is closer to a genuine unraveling of the closest relationships in Harry's life. And I think that context deserves real attention rather than staying background noise to the podcast headline. Start with Meghan's absence during this specific stretch. That wasn't incidental timing. It read to a lot of observers as a fairly clear signal on its own. When the person who's supposed to be standing closest to you chooses distance instead during exactly the period you most obviously need support, that reads as something considerably more pointed than a scheduling coincidence. The read a lot of commentators landed on, she saw where this particular stretch was heading and deliberately positioned herself away from the fallout before it fully arrived. Then there's the meeting with Charles, which by most accounts was tightly controlled and notably brief. Why so restricted? The likely answer is fairly straightforward: institutional damage control. The palace, protecting its own image, moving carefully to avoid feeding into whatever storm was already building. Charles was reportedly willing to see his grandchildren, genuinely, but he apparently drew a firm line well short of anything resembling full public reconciliation. No joint photograph, no official statement smoothing things over publicly. That's not warmth in any conventional sense. That's careful, deliberate containment. Picture what that actually represents. The single most powerful figure in the country, holding back from fully and publicly supporting his own son. Whether that reflects genuine personal disappointment or simply necessary emotional distance, either explanation still lands as a real blow. And then there's William specifically, whose reported feelings toward Harry go well past ordinary sibling tension into something closer to complete rejection. A firm boundary, reportedly including keeping Harry away from William's own children entirely. That's not a minor family disagreement that fades with time. That's the kind of rupture that tends to echo across an entire family structure for years, shaping relationships well beyond just the two people directly involved. So where was Meghan specifically in all of this unfolding? Not by his side, when it apparently mattered most. Not a quiet, incidental absence, but a considered, deliberate step back, which says something fairly clear about where her head is at regarding the whole situation. She's not the only one pulling away either. The people who were once closest to Harry have been steadily distancing themselves. His brother has rejected him outright. His father maintains only minimal, carefully managed contact, seemingly protecting himself from further fallout as much as anything else. This genuinely goes well past what most people would consider ordinary family drama or a temporary rough patch, when the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally make a clear, strategic choice to protect themselves first, even temporarily. That's a genuine kind of loss that money, fame, or influence simply can't repair. That's the real core of what's tragic here. Not the embarrassment of one podcast going badly, but the deeper isolation sitting underneath it. Being set apart by your own family specifically. A lot of people watching this unfold have likely lived some version of it themselves. That specific, painful moment of realizing someone you care about genuinely isn't going to change no matter how much you want them to, and eventually reaching the point where protecting your own well-being has to come before continuing to absorb the fallout from theirs. That appears to be roughly the path his own family has quietly taken here. What Meghan is apparently doing without announcing it. What William is doing, evidently not without real difficulty. Behavioral researchers have separately noted a recurring, well-documented pattern in people who experience enormous success very early in their lives without the right kind of grounding influence consistently around them to keep genuine perspective intact over time. It's not really about one off-color joke landing badly. The deeper concern is something closer to a genuine break from accurate self-perception. Someone sufficiently disconnected from how the world is actually receiving them that they can no longer clearly locate where things went wrong or where they're currently heading as a result. What makes this particular situation feel avoidable, in hindsight, is how simple the actual intervention would have needed to be. One honest, difficult conversation. One person willing to say plainly, "This isn't landing the way you think it's landing." That conversation apparently never happened. At least not in a way that changed anything, so the same patterns kept repeating and compounding rather than correcting. Here's the part that genuinely lands hardest out of everything we've covered, especially for anyone who's personally watched this exact kind of slow drift happen in someone they care about in their own life. This isn't really about a single misstep anymore, and hasn't been for a while. It's about gradually losing the ability to accurately register that a misstep has even occurred. Surrounded consistently by agreement rather than honest pushback, the entire concept of getting something wrong starts to become almost unfamiliar, a kind of mirror maze with no obvious way back out. Credibility, once solid, now sits on genuinely uncertain ground. Doors that used to open easily, sponsorships, partnerships, charitable affiliations, are reportedly closing, some with real finality attached. The damage isn't purely external either. How someone sees themselves gets genuinely challenged when a moment like this plays out in front of millions of people simultaneously, and there's a real chance the full weight of that hasn't fully landed yet. There's a specific psychological tipping point where someone becomes disconnected enough from the world around them that finding the way back, rebuilding an accurate bridge to how they're actually being perceived, becomes an almost insurmountable task rather than a simple correction. This isn't purely a career problem at this specific point anymore, and framing it purely in career terms genuinely undersells what's actually happening. It's closer to something existential in nature. Without genuine reflection, without someone willing to interrupt the pattern honestly, the road ahead looks considerably more uncertain than it did even a year or two back. There's one more thing worth saying plainly before we get to where this might actually go from here. Isolation like this rarely announces itself in a single dramatic moment. It builds slowly, decision by decision, each small distancing move feeling justified on its own terms at the time it happens. Nobody in Harry's family likely woke up one morning and decided deliberately to cut him off completely. It's more probable that each individual boundary, William's, Charles's, even Meghan's apparent step back, accumulated gradually, each one a reasonable feeling response to the specific moment it happened in, until the sum of all those individually reasonable choices added up to something that now looks, from the outside, like total isolation. So where does this actually go from here, given everything we've walked through? Based on the pattern so far, the likely response isn't sudden clarity or course correction. It's more probably retreat, or doubling down on the same behavior that created the problem in the first place, closing off the very possibility of genuine growth. We may simply be watching a live case study in denial playing out in real time. And what makes it genuinely sad, rather than just entertaining to watch, is that so much of this looks like it could have been avoided with one honest conversation, delivered by someone with enough standing and enough courage to actually say the hard thing out loud. What do you genuinely think? Is there still a realistic path back for Harry from here? Some version of course correction that could still happen? Or has too much genuinely broken down at this point to be meaningfully repaired? And do you buy the isolation and yes men theory as a real explanation for how someone ends up this disconnected from how they're actually being perceived? Or does that feel like too generous a read on choices that were, at the end of the day, entirely his own to make? Let me know your honest takedown in the comments. I read every single one of them. And if you want more breakdowns exactly like this one, subscribe to Palace Insider so you catch the next update the moment it drops. I'll see you in the next one.